Everybody, welcome especially to the Humboldt alumni and colleagues from the Alexander von Humboldt. This is our fourth Humboldt dialogue in this series of society, science, and policy lessons from the coronavirus pandemic. Hopefully in the near future, we won't have to mention coronavirus anymore, but some of these topics clearly are lasting ones, generational topics. So I'm excited to listen to the presentations today. The speakers will present for 10 minutes each. Q&A will happen afterwards. Please put your questions in the chat, as we've all learned to do on each of these Zoom calls. And do please unmute your microphone. Only because of the topic, it's worth saying again that you will be recorded. And that's not a conspiracy, that's just what we're doing. So Louise Davidson Schmidt will be our moderator for this session. She's my colleague on the American Friends of the Alexander von Humboldt Board and a professor of political science at the University of Miami. Her research focuses on gender and politics, especially in the German context. She's the author of Gender Quotas and Democratic Participation, Recruiting Candidates for Elective Office in Germany. Professor Davidson Schmidt was awarded the German Chancellor Fellowship in 1996-1997 for research on budget politics at the Humboldt University in Berlin. And with that, Louise, please take it away.
All right, thank you very much. And I'll leave it to our speakers to adjudicate whether it's not a conspiracy, it's just what we do, is a logical statement or maybe not. I'm really excited to be here today and to meet personally some scholars whose work I've read with interest over the years, and I'm really happy to be meeting, not quite in person, but almost. So good morning from here in Miami. What I'll do is I'll introduce both of our speakers and their topics, and then as Elizabeth said, each one will speak for about 10 minutes, and then we'll have an opportunity to have a Q&A session to pick their brains a little more closely about topics that we're all interested in. So our first speaker today is Professor Cas Mudde, who comes from the University of Georgia, where he's the Stanley Wade Shelton Professor in the Department of International Affairs. And he kind of wrote the book on populist radical right parties in Europe. His 2007 book won a number of different prizes. He's more recently written about the Israeli settler movement. And he comes to us today as a Humboldtian. He received the Friedrich Wilhelm Bessel Award from the Humboldt Foundation in 2015. And he's also someone, I think, who does a really great job of bridging doing, I guess, what we would call scientific communication, bridging the gap between academic work and more popular understanding of what goes on within academia. He's a columnist for The Guardian, and he has a bi-weekly podcast that looks at radical aspects of a number of sort of everyday aspects of everyday life. And today he's going to be speaking first. And he's going to be talking about the kind of the supply side of the populist equation. And that is who are the parties and who are the elites, especially in Western Europe, who are kind of providing some of this anti-science populist sentiment. And our second speaker comes to us today from the UK. Dr. Stijn van Kessel is a senior lecturer in European politics at Queen Mary University of London. And he too has written about populist parties in Europe in a 2015 book. And he's also writing or about to publish a book on the failure of Remain anti-Brexit activism in the UK. And based on what I read in the headlines this morning, this seems like it's more timely than ever before. He is a joint editor of a Routledge book series on extremism and democracy, and he too was a Humboldtian. He was awarded an Alexander von Humboldt Foundation Research Fellowship for postdoctoral researchers between 2013 and 2015. And he'll be speaking second and looking at the flip side of that equation, the demand side, and looking at citizen attitudes toward conspiracies and populism. And so without further ado, I'll turn the screen over to Cas, who will be our first speaker. So welcome and thank you very much.
Thank you for the nice introduction, Louise. Let's see whether I can actually share this screen. That will be roughly what I will be talking about. So what I want to focus on is a set the supply side. So what mostly populist parties have done and have said about COVID and the pandemic. Now, perhaps let's start a little bit with terminology, because while we're talking here about populism, populism is an ideological feature that is shared by a broad variety of actors, some on the left, some on the center, some on the right. And when we're talking about COVID-19, particularly in the European context, but I would say more broadly, left-wing populists have not stood out particularly in their response. And so I focus primarily on right-wing populism, or what I would call the far right. And of these, we're thinking about political parties like Alternative for Germany, the AfD in Germany, Freiheitliche Partei Österreichs in Austria, or someone like President Trump in the US. And if you look at it theoretically, then the position of populists in general, and the populist radical right in particular, towards science is not necessarily hostile, although populists generally divide the world into the pure people in moral terms on the one hand and the corrupt elite on the other. And they believe in so-called common sense politics. And so those are politics that are allegedly neither ideological nor particularly difficult. This is just what everyone understands. And so at a certain point, in a certain way, of course, common sense and expertise are in a problematic relationship. However, that doesn't mean that populists by definition reject science or expertise or experts. History has shown that there are various populist leaders who have had actually what were believed to be experts as ministers. Now, the general idea about the relationship between populism and COVID-19 is very much determined through the specific case of Donald Trump, as almost everything has been since 2016. And so the idea is that Trump denied the existence of COVID-19, minimized the importance of it, and opposed all kind of measures. Now, first of all, as quite often with the popular image of Trump or the far right more broadly, this is a simplification. Trump never really denied COVID-19. At best, he minimized its impact. He was also not against all measures and played a reasonable role in developing the vaccine, and is even today still defending the vaccine. So that is important to keep in mind, that even the Trump kind of stereotype was already kind of stronger than it was. But importantly, today, the far right or right-wing populism is a very heterogeneous group of actors that hold very different positions on a lot of what to them are generally secondary issues. And this is the same with COVID-19. Now, I did a study with a former graduate student of mine, Jacob Wondres, where we looked at how European far-right parties responded to COVID-19 in the first wave. So roughly March 2020 till July. And in many countries, the far right were among the first to take COVID serious. And this actually makes sense because it perfectly fit the key nativist narrative of the far right. Namely, this is a foreign threat which has to be fought by closing the borders. Now, of course, that point was soon shared by everyone. because all parties wanted to close the borders, at which point in time the whole nativist trope didn't really pay off anymore. This notwithstanding, I would say in the first months, in many countries, the far right supported strong measures, particularly lockdowns, but very short ones. This changed along the way, and particularly in the second wave. And this changed probably in part because the support base of these parties were very much anti-lockdown measures. And so in some cases, the parties just bent towards their electorates. What we saw is that in general, they weren't against vaccinations, for example. They weren't against certain measures, but they were against particularly very strict lockdowns and kind of enforced vaccination. And what we saw was that particularly those far-right parties that were in opposition started to adopt a populist frame on COVID-19 and the pandemic, pretty much seeing it increasingly as not necessarily a hoax, but something that wasn't as bad as the elites said, and that the mainstream parties were using it to kind of force through all kind of rules that just helped them, but were at the expense of the people. Now, at the same time, there are various countries where the far right is in power, also in Europe, mostly Poland and Hungary, but there are some other countries where the far right was in coalition. What we noticed there is that they didn't behave much different than governments without far right parties. They didn't perform worse in terms of cases or in terms of deaths or in terms of vaccinations. So in fact, one of the big differences of the response of the far right was whether you were in government or in opposition. Now, we did see a significant radicalization after the first wave. Since then, most radical right parties no longer support measures. They are not against vaccinations, but they're against forced vaccinations or against creating what they say as a two-tier type of society of the vaccinated and the non-vaccinated. And I think the most interesting thing is that we have seen some new coalitions emerge. So when we look at protests against COVID measures, then there are roughly three groups. One is just a generic anti-government conspiracy theory group. These are people who were always against the government, be it about UFOs or about 5G or whatever other conspiracy theory they have. They don't belong anywhere really politically. They're not necessarily left or right. They're just conspiracy theories. Then we have the far right, which in many countries has led the pushback against the measures, also in the streets. Think about AfD, think about the FPÖ in Austria. And then there is a third group, which is a part of the alternative wellness sector. Let's say the yoga moms, as they're sometimes called. And so what they share is, first of all, a kind of a libertarian view about what you should do with your body, which is an anti-state perception there, but also some kind of weird natural health understanding. This coalition doesn't make sense on many levels because in many ways, these are not just people who tend to be more in the liberal democratic camp in terms of general positions, but also socio-demographically, these tend to be more upper middle class, many more women than men, whereas traditionally the far right has far more men than women, generally lower educated. These have come together in the streets and particularly on social media. The whole question, though, is will this alliance survive the pandemic? Because in many ways, they don't have much in common, except of a fairly generic anti-government sentiment, which can't be mobilized as easily on other things. That being said, there are some studies that show that even on the Ukraine war, this alliance has held a little bit, and that both these groups oppose the sanctions, for example. So I don't want to make this group too big. These groups are big on the internet because that's where they live. And a protest of a few thousand people gets massive attention in the media. If you talk electorally, this is not going to shift much. Right? This alternative wellness community is not, we're not talking about 10, 15 seats or something. So we see some changes, but most importantly, I think the stereotype is of a Trumpian far right is too simplistic. And the response of the far right is relatively heterogeneous because the far right itself is relatively heterogeneous. And that's it.
Thanks very much. And we will just turn it over to our second speaker and do questions after that. And if you do have a question for Cas, please put it in the chat.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Louise, also for the kind introduction. I'm going to try and share my screen now. It's always get a bit busy because I have two screens and then things change around. Can you see the slides now? Yeah. Okay, so this seems to work. So yeah, we agreed, Cas and I, that I focus more on citizens rather than political actors, parties, and politicians, and in particular the relationship between populist attitudes and proneness to believe in conspiracy theories. I'll touch also on COVID conspiracies in particular, but the presentation is a little bit broader than that, given that fortunately COVID seems to be episodic, or it was an event that goes. So it might be interesting to look more generally at the proneness to conspiracy theories, especially amongst those who have strong populist attitudes. Now, I'll introduce the issue or the theme of populist attitudes a little bit more. So studies on populism have predominantly in the past decades focused on populism as a characteristic of political actors, so political parties or politicians, rather than individuals. But more recently, there's been quite a lot of research, in fact, that has also treated populism as a characteristic of individuals, and namely populism as an attitude. So populism in citizens, in individuals. And this is generally measured through surveys. So typically, people are asked a battery of questions on the basis of which they are put on a scale of whether they are strongly populist or not. An example of such a battery of questions is here. This is what I used together with my colleague in my own research, but this is based on the well-known scale of Ackerman and Kasmudde and Zaslov. So this is basically in survey data how populist attitudes are measured. So people are asked these battery of questions. For instance, the politicians in this country need to follow the will of the people. The people, not politicians, should make our most important policy decisions, etc., etc. I would rather be represented by a citizen than a specialized politician. So all these statements, they basically measure the extent to which people are dissatisfied with politicians and think that power should be returned to ordinary people. So together, if you look at the answers regarding these questions, you can determine whether or not an individual is marked by strong populist attitudes. And in turn, that's not the end of the story. Of course, in turn, you can then see whether strong populist attitudes has consequences for other types of political behavior, not least voting behavior. Which parties do these populist individuals vote for? Now, in general, what have studies so far indicated? So studies indicate that populist attitudes are, first of all, widespread. So it's not the case that only supporters of populist actors are populist. Actually, a lot of citizens have these populist attitudes. Studies have also indicated that these populist attitudes are more complex than mere anti-establishment attitudes. So populism is not just about what is wrong with politics, it also offers a worldview outlining how politics should be. So populism very much centers on the idea of popular sovereignty, so returning power to the people. So populism, also in terms of attitudes, is not the same as simply being anti-elite or being anti-establishment. Other scholars have argued that populist attitudes tend to be latent or kind of dormant, like people may be populist, but it might not really affect their behavior or their political choices. It's often only after populist entrepreneurs kind of activate these populist attitudes that populist attitudes start to matter. For instance, in terms of vote choice. So other research has also shown that populist attitudes are related to support for populist parties and populist individuals. So people with stronger populist attitudes, it's kind of logical, are also more likely to support populist actors. Okay, so moving to the topic of today, what about populist attitudes and conspiracism? So first of all, I'd like to kind of highlight to kind of, not go into sort of the common myth that populist people or people voting for populist parties tend to be apathetic or politically uninformed. Actually, research shows that this is wrong. Research actually shows that people with strong populist attitudes or those supporting populist parties tend to be above average interested in politics. Maybe because, you know, they've been sort of awoken by these political entrepreneurs that have voiced this dissatisfaction with established politics. So it's not the case also that they show less political knowledge necessarily than your average citizens. However, there is a clear, research shows that there's now a clear association between populism and conspiracism, or proneness to believe in conspiracy theories. And some authors have actually said that this is very logical because there's an important conceptual overlap. Arguably, populism is about the very idea of political elites conspiring against the people. So populism and conspiracy theories are kind of two sides of the same coin, so to speak. So I quote here from Castanho Silva and his colleagues. They argue in their article, which actually shows indeed that populist attitudes and belief in conspiracy theories are related. Populism and conspiracism are both marked by simple narratives with two well-defined sides, separated on moral grounds. Populists see conspirators controlling society and ordinary people as their victims. So there's this kind of logical connection between populism and conspiracism. And research, a recent article, so I'm actually referring more to work of others than work of myself, because I have done some work on populist attitudes, but not necessarily conspiracy theories, and certainly not COVID-19 conspiracy theories in particular. But fortunately, there are a group of young colleagues from Austria have actually published this very interesting paper, which links populist attitudes in particular to conspiracy theories about COVID-19 in particular. So what they do is ask, or they had a survey in which these questions were asked. So again, a battery of questions that kind of measure the belief in COVID-19 conspiracy belief. So there are various statements. For instance, the vaccine against the coronavirus has already been developed, but is being held back by large pharmaceutical companies. Or indeed, the coronavirus is a bioweapon that was deliberately developed to harm humans. Or Bill Gates wants to vaccinate humanity by force in order to earn a lot of money, etc. So these are the type of questions that were asked in the survey, and people either agree or not. And people that tend to agree with a lot of these statements clearly can be marked as those who are more prone to believe in these COVID-19 conspiracy beliefs. Actually, note that they found that a lot of people kind of agreed or thought there was some truth in some of these claims. So again, these beliefs are not only limited to a small number of kind of loonies on the fringes. In the end, however, they do find that the stronger a person's populist attitudes, the more likely this person is to believe in conspiracy theories. So they show that this link between the two concepts, conspiracism and populism in attitudes, with regard to the theme of COVID-19 in particular. What they furthermore kind of reveal is the causal mechanism that underlies this relationship between populist attitudes and belief in COVID-19 conspiracy beliefs. Namely, it goes through these two kind of variables in the middle, so trust in science and research and trust in political institutions. So the causal mechanism is as such, they argue, if you have stronger populist attitudes, you are less likely to trust in science and research, and also less likely to trust in political institutions. And in turn, this lack of trust leads to these people being more likely to believe in these COVID-19 conspiracy belief. So that's kind of the causal mechanism they identify. Yeah, and a few other, I think, as if I remember this correctly, they also look at whether a person is left or right. And as you see on the right-hand side of this slide, right-wing people are actually also more likely than left-wing people to believe in COVID-19 conspiracy belief. And this kind of links a little bit to the observation that Cas made about the supply side. So a few key points to end off with, to kind of summarize. So scholars theorize and show a natural affinity between populism or populist attitudes and conspiracism. And as this recent paper shows, distrust in political and scientific elites appears to be this key mediating factor. So trust in institutions is an important factor in the causal chain, if you like. A little bit my 2 cents to end off with maybe some room for discussion. So what I would say based on these findings is that it looks like general factors that are conducive to populism, so general contextual factors, are then also likely to feed the spread of conspiracy theories. And then you can think of very general factors such as disengagement from established parties. So people being less aligned, voting less for the traditional parties in the center with which people 50 years ago were much more aligned, and therefore also more likely to act on what these party elites said. So parties cue citizens to a much lesser extent. Citizens get their information from other sources, including populist actors who are more likely to spread conspiracy theories, at least in theory. A changing media landscape, so especially social media, the advent of social media leading to kind of the disappearance of editors, news editors, as people that control which news goes out and what information is spread to the public. So information, also the wrong kind of information, floating more freely. And the normalization of populist actors, and Cas has written extensively about this. So mainstream parties also play a role in the normalization of populist actors and their rhetoric because they fear the electoral competition of populist actors and radical right actors in particular. Not all populists are radical right, but there's an important category of populist actors who are radical right. Mainstream parties taking over parts of their agenda, therefore legitimizing kind of what populists say, including arguably their the spread of untruths and conspiracy theories. So this is kind of the diagnosis. The solutions, that was also a part of this workshop. I'm shying away a little bit from that, but maybe this comes back in the conclusion. So thanks very much for your attention.
Thank you very much to both of our speakers. Those were very interesting presentations, and I think they've given us a lot of food for thought. What I would like to do is to collect maybe 2 or 3 questions and then ask them of our speakers, have them a chance to respond, and then do another round for the remaining half hour that we have. And I as the moderator, I'm going to take the liberty of asking the first question. And just as I was thinking in my head, Stein, you said, well, you know, solutions was supposed to be part of this, but maybe we can talk about that later. But I'm really interested in this, especially given that this is a Humboldt Foundation meeting. If people don't trust science or scientific expertise, then is there anything that the scientific community can do to dispel some of these arguments that are scientifically inaccurate? Because if people don't trust us, then, you know, what can we do? But along with that, I also want to ask the question, we can see anti-science attitudes among populist actors, either from the right or from the left, but not all science is challenged, right? It seems like there's And I want to go back to how Cass started off talking about this idea of common sense. I mean, I think some of the anti-science attitudes, I study gender, right? And there's a lot of populist opposition to what's the so-called gender ideology. They don't want to fund gender studies professors. And I can see how maybe in questions of, relationships between men and women or human sexuality, that people have common sense about these issues because, everyone has everyday lived experiences of these things. But, an mRNA vaccine, that's not, I don't understand. I mean, that doesn't seem like common sense would tell us one thing or another about vaccines. So why are there conspiracies or why are there challenges to vaccines and not say, something like nutrition? Why are people not saying, there's no such thing as calories or the food pyramid's wrong? Like, why are they taking on vaccine science and not nutrition science or anthropology or etymology or other sciences? So my two questions are, I guess, how can scientists do anything to stop anti-science attitudes if people don't believe us? And second, why do some scientists get a hit and not another? And then just to collect another one before I go back to you, we have a question from David Chapman in the chat, and he's asking, could you speak more about the idea that populism is latent or dormant? In what fraction of the population in various nationalities? So I guess is the question, are Americans differently prone to conspiracy thinking or populist thinking than are Germans or Austrians or the Dutch? So I'll turn it back over, whichever one of you wants to take a first stab at that. And again, if people have other questions, they're welcome to put those into the chat.
Maybe I'll take the first one and definitely have the second one for Stijn. I'm not so sure whether there are no conspiracy theories about nutrition. I think the key thing is when science becomes politicized or becomes part of politics, then the conspiracy theories are triggered. And so, yes, it is true that just as a lot of non-populists, there is a sizable portion of the population who doesn't believe that political science is a science. And I'm actually not necessarily against that view, let alone that women's studies are not real and grievance studies, those kind of things, they're widely shared, right? And at the same time, it's often then kind of countered with physics or biology, which are real sciences. But then you see actually that in terms of climate change, you have exactly the same type of conspiracy theories, right? And so actually that hard sciences versus soft sciences doesn't matter once something becomes part of the political debate. If we would we have debates, for example, about whether soft drinks can be sold at schools and things like that. Pretty certain that if that would become bigger, that you will get conspiracy theories about nutrition and that this is just the left-wing liberal elite who is trying to use this to push through something. So the thing is, and I think that is important, we all are selective in what we consider as an authoritative source, but we all have them. We have this simplistic view of that we are the rational person who think about everything, and are scientifically literate, etc., etc. And then on the other side are the dummies who don't know anything, they just have opinions. But that's not how the world works. And that is actually the problematic thing about it. And particularly when you're in the US, you should understand that we live in different realities, where different camps have different facts. They don't just have different opinions, they have different facts. And so among the COVID deniers, people have studies that allegedly show that only a few thousand people died of COVID. So it's not that we are actually seeing the same world and then have a different opinion about whether that is good or bad. That would be easier to communicate. We have different sources, and we have different facts, and we have different experts, right? And so The far right loves Harvard professors if they make the argument that supports them. Very few do, right? But if there is one, that person will be all the time. Just think about how everyone jumped on Jordan Peterson. Like, it's not just because he has a YouTube channel, that's because he was a reputed psychologist. And so to a certain extent, the far right / populist have kind of a shadow academic world, right? Where they reference COVID scholars or doctors or medical professionals or whatever, the same with climate change. And that makes the whole conversation so hard, because you're no longer talking just about, is this good or bad, which is already problematic, but is this, right? Is this happening? And you can say, well, but the New York Times said that, but for them, the New York Times is not a relevant source. And they will say, well, but Breitbart says this. And for us, Breitbart is not a good source. So I think that we're not fundamentally different, but we do live in fundamentally different worlds.
Stein, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I can sort of, I hope I'm not too rambling, but I've various thoughts about this. I think one of the key observations from Cass is, and I completely concur, it's really to do with the politicization of this particular crisis that sort of led to this conspiracy thinking regarding vaccines in particular. But I think that the same principle could apply to other forms of science and nutrition. And it kind of also links into the idea that populism kind of feeds on the back of a crisis, or a perceived crisis at least. Although in this case, it's a little bit different, I think, than, for instance, a migrant crisis, or because here, as also was evident from the presentation of Cass, it was not such an easy crisis for populists or the radical right in particular to capitalize on, partly because I've talked about the tendency of people with populist attitudes to be more prone to conspiracy theories, but I believe a lot of voters for these parties were fine with vaccines. So the natural supporters of populist parties and populist radical right parties also were not necessarily all in agreement with the fact that COVID was kind of a result of, it was invented in a lab, or etc. So it was a much more difficult crisis to navigate for populist political actors also, I think. I can say a bit about populism being latent. So, and this is not my research, this is the research of Kirk Hawkins and collaborators in particular who have looked in this and sort of forwarded this theory. Cristobal Rovira-Kaltwasser also. I'm not so sure about cross-national variety, whether there's really a difference between countries in terms of the levels of whether people in Germany are less latently populist than people in the US. Some of the data certainly comes from the US, and basically the idea is that a populist attitude, a lot of people are likely to sort of agree with all these statements that I showed you, like, okay, politicians should listen more to the will of the people. A lot of people think, often with good reasons, that politicians are a bit rubbish, or that they don't listen enough to what people want, etc. But they don't do much with it. So it kind of requires a political actor who capitalizes on this anger and who kind of fuels the dissatisfaction with political actors for these populist attitudes to actually matter, for them to translate into political action. So that is kind of the general idea of the notion that populism is a latent construct, or it's a latent attitude. But I think this various this data has been looked at in various contexts. Yeah, also showing, I know, data on the basis of Chile. This is research by Cristobal Rovira-Kaltwasser, who has shown this difference of people with strong populist attitudes versus people who are completely apathetic and who are very unlikely to participate in the political process and to go out to vote in the first place. It's actually people with populist attitudes are very much motivated to participate and have strong views about democracy. And what can scientists do about sort of countering anti-science conspiracy theories? this is quite difficult. I think a lot of scientists want to be scientists and do not necessarily want to appear on the foreground. I think there's an issue, especially these days, that social scientists are often distrusted by precisely those people who have a tendency to vote for the radical right in particular. So we're seen as sort of representatives of the left-wing church, so to speak. We're seen as woke, etc. So I think it's especially the media and mainstream politicians who have a big responsibility not to put people who spread clear conspiracy theories or untruths on, for instance, their talk shows. If I look at the Dutch, I've been outside the Netherlands for a while, but I often see snippets of Dutch talk shows where they invite far-right actors, but also people telling complete nonsense. So I think it's these actors that have a prime responsibility regarding not giving airtime to people who objectively speak nonsense. And that is something else from saying that, right, people who criticize political elites should not be provided a platform, because it's often the case that populists have a point, right, in criticizing at least some elements of what political elites do. Okay, I hope that was somewhat coherent. Thanks very much.
Yeah, I think that was definitely coherent. And it's actually a nice segue into some more questions that are coming in through the chat. And so there's the question saying, well, the hosts of talk shows shouldn't have these people on. And I think this kind of relates to Eric Koenig's question that he's asking here. Do you have recommendations for how governments could reduce the spread of conspiracism? So is there room for a law that says you can't have these people on your show, or what can governments do? Because I think also it's very tricky, right? Because if governments do things, that could be further proof for people who feel that there's a conspiracy to silence them, that indeed actually they, government regulations are silencing them or trying to crack down on them. So one question is, what can the government do? A second question we have from Martin Stuta is, how do you feel about the future of populism? Is it still growing everywhere, or is there evidence somewhere that a peak has been reached? It is a severe crisis threatening survival of our democracies and more. And I guess I think that question, we might also think of that question as if there is a portion of the population that's latently prone to populist thinking or conspiracy thinking, what portion of the population is that, and how big could this get? And then our third question says, it's from Richard Hagland. I continue to be puzzled by anti-elite sentiment from people whose education and or wealth make them elite by objective yardsticks. What about their experience makes them want to differentiate themselves from others like them who are more influenced by the outcome of free discussion or curating or editing functions in mainstream media outlets? So again, and I think that's, I think that's a great question too, because if we look at some populist leaders themselves, they don't seem to line up very well with what most people are like in terms of their wealth or their demographics. So again, here, three questions. What should the government do? What's the future? What is the underlying size of this group? And why are, objectively speaking, elites anti-elites? So Cass, did you want to take a first stab at that?
Yeah, so I will work back because I like the last question, and I always find it kind of surprising that people are surprised by it. But maybe that is where you live and where you teach. I teach various kids of elites who feel that they are victims of the elite. And what is important is that the distinction between the elite and the people is not on the basis of wealth, not on the basis of education, it's not on the basis of your position of power, it's on the basis of morality, the basis of norms. And again, if you live in the US in particular, and you look at what the conservative media infrastructure has, how it has portrayed the US over the last 3 decades, by and large, then you understand why they feel victims of the elites. Because talk radio, Christian radio, Fox News, a massive infrastructure, has been arguing for decades that there is a left liberal elite that controls our universities, our state, our media, and particularly in the US context, discriminates against white Christian Americans. And as a consequence, what you find these days is that among white evangelicals, they believe that white evangelicals are the most discriminated people in the US, more than African Americans. And that's not weird, because that's what they have heard their whole life, right? And so I teach some of these students, including in my course on the far right. Like, I teach far right students in my course on the far right, and I can assure you, I have absolutely zero influence on them. At the end of the course, they are as committed to the fact that Trump is a victim, Trump is not far right, etc., etc. And why would they change in my 3-month class if they have heard this and still hear this at home among their friends on the radio, like 24/7? And so this is not just a simplistic social media bubble, right? Social media is only a very small part of that larger bubble. There is a massive infrastructure, even in countries like Germany or the Netherlands, for example. One of our key tabloids in the Netherlands, like, is the Telegraaf, which by and large has the same type of narrative. Now, the Telegraaf, when I grew up, was a very respected right-wing like paper, right? And so this is just one of the mainstream papers, tabloid, sure, right? And so people who read that get that not just from some vague account on Twitter, they get it from what they consider as legitimate sources. And again, the key reason why they believe that they are victims is because not of their money or their power, it's because they believe that their values, which are traditional values or Christian values or whatever it is, that those are under attack of some alleged left-wing elite. What the government can do, I'm very skeptical, to be honest. But so on the downside is I'm very skeptical about what we can do about conspiracy theories. At the same time, conspiracy theories are not necessarily highly problematic. Like, there's nothing new, of course, about conspiracy theories. Like, in the 1970s, the favorite pastime of Americans was to talk about who killed JFK, right? All conspiracy theories. Conspiracy theories don't have to become politically relevant. As said, this is like latent. People have them, they don't necessarily act on it. The question also is, what do they add? Like, so if you're already populist, does it really matter that you also have conspiracy theories on COVID, or is that a logical consequence of being populist, right? And so I think we shouldn't be too worried about conspiracy theory. More than anything, this is all about pretty much media literacy, right? And media literacy is very hard to teach, particularly in highly polarized countries like the US. Because it assumes that we all agree on what the right media is, right? And in that sense, we're far away. Now, on the positive side, I personally think that populism has roughly peaked, in the sense that it has been punching above its electoral weight. Populist parties are actually not as big as you would think. Overall, perhaps 25%, 33% of the people have voted for them. At the same time, I've argued that over the last 2 decades, they have set the agenda in many ways. COVID-19 has actually changed that to a certain extent. The Ukraine war now has also changed that, has moved away from certain topics, has brought expertise back on the agenda. That doesn't mean that populists will disappear, right? Populist radical right is here to stay. But I think that their disproportionate agenda setting power in particular, that might have peaked for the moment. but Stein might disagree.
Stein?
Thanks very much for throwing the ball to me. I have not many things to add to what Cas said. A few thoughts I had in the meantime. I mean, yeah, starting with populism vanishing. I mean, populism is an inherent part of democracy, and I might have raised the impression or associate populism a little bit too normatively with the spread of untruths and conspiracy theories. In fact, populism often emerges or can emerge in a more healthy context, I suppose, when it's a warning signal that there is something wrong with what the established political actors are doing when they are unresponsive to people. So it can be a warning sign or a corrective. That doesn't always necessarily mean that populists come with the right solutions, but it can be a self-correcting, it can act as a self-correcting system. And so it's not, it will be there, especially in an age in countries and democracies where there are high levels of partisan de-alignment, where people do not feel connected to a certain political party anymore. So they're more, that's also a positive interpretation, that people have become more critical of political elites. They're not following elites anymore like sheep, or that they stick to the political party that represents their socio-economic group or their socio-cultural group, etc. So populism will always be there. And of course, you also have to separate populism from the radical right, right? I mean, populism is an element of most of radical right actors. It's an important element, I would even say, but that's a different question, whether the radical right has peaked versus whether populism has peaked. Yeah, the other thing about elites, that's also what I kind of want to emphasize. Like, the elites and the people are, of course, to a large extent, social constructs. So I am quite charmed by the idea, the interpretation of populism as a frame, as a way to understand the world, like as a way to kind of make sense of reality and to try and influence people's views of the world also. So populism is a frame that interprets society where you have this conspiring elites against the ordinary people. But who the elite are and who the people are, these are sort of empty vessels, or it needs to be, they need to be given meaning. So it's not the case that if you're part of the economic elite, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're part of the economic elite as conceived, or of the elite as conceived by populists. So yeah, these categories should not be treated as given, so to say.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question, and we have one in the chat from Bill Colglazer, who asks, can you speak about the situation in the US where Trump populists are highly motivated by seeing government officials and scientists as trying to restrict their individual rights by implementing mask mandates, vaccine mandates, restricting gun ownerships, etc. So I guess here, you know, the question is talking about the framing as who the elites are in the US and what they're doing.
Yeah, I mean, one thing in which the US far right has always stood out is, from the European far right in particular, is in its anti-state, particularly anti-federal state position. And so traditionally the far right is actually in favor of a strong state, like that's what fascism is all about. In the US, for whatever reasons, the far right has always had a very strong libertarian, or at least anti-federal state part. And that comes together very strongly here in COVID, right? And so that, of course, blends in well with populism and anti-establishment sentiment. At the same time, you also have to keep in mind that the state as such is always seen through politics. And so, for example, the state under Biden, like, will have a much harder time to get people to do stuff than the state under Trump. And if Trump would have actually supported, and the Republican Party would have actually supported, like, mask mandates, etc., etc., the group that would actually have opposed it would have been much, much smaller. But from the beginning, like, this was politicized. And again, I live in Georgia, and when you wear a mask in my place, like, that is a very clear signal. Like, people will see me as a liberal. And so this has become politicized in the US context, which is in which allies with this general pseudo-libertarian, because the libertarianism is always selective, right? Not on abortion, for example, right? But that is easy to mobilize here. But we have to keep in mind that studies show, for example, that there's only a very small group that really is principled against vaccination. A sizable group of people who are still not vaccinated. In my town, 50% is not vaccinated, right? Which is a liberal college town. A lot of these people are not Republicans, first of all. Like, there's a lot of skepticism in African-American communities, some other communities. And others don't have particularly strong feelings about it. But that's the other thing. COVID is different from the refugee crisis, for example, right? A so-called refugee crisis, almost no one sees a refugee. Everyone has a direct connection to COVID or a COVID measure. And so opposing, for example, not drinking plastic water bottles, or opposing having something injected into your veins, is a very different thing. And so again, like, many of my students were not getting vaccinated, not because they're populist or radical right, but because they had read that it could interfere with their fertility. Now, they don't know for sure, right? But they're young and they think, what are the chances that this is going to be very bad? What are the chances that this could happen? And so they don't do it. And so I think that is important. COVID is a very specific type, and the type of policies that have been implemented are much more far-reaching than almost any other issue, including coming really to, like, our personal being. And then it makes more sense that people who are already distrustful of the state, like, will activate it. But once again, it is very important to keep the political context in this, and this is one of the big tragedies of the US. Right? I mean, Biden can pretty much not reach the vast majority of the group that needs to be reached.
And Stein, did you want to have the last word here?
No, not on US politics. I'll refrain from. I'll completely leave that to Cas.
All right. Well, this was a great talk. I think really interesting. A lot of food for thought, right? You know, you don't want to have a needle stuck in your arm, but yet you're perfectly willing to have women go through with unwanted pregnancies. Like, how do you put that together? Anyway, so I will leave it on that note. Thanks to everyone for attending. Thank you especially to our two speakers, and thank you to Elizabeth for the kind introduction of me, and to the staff at the Alexander von Humboldt Stiftung and friends for organizing this whole thing.